On November 3, 2020, I am sending a complaint to ESMA under file number ESMA/2020/BUL/505 as part of a UCITS infringement report. The European Securities and Markets Authority is the competent European supervisory authority of the Bafin. With my complaint of November 19, 2020, I show how the Bafin failed at Sparkus Fulda. I forward my petition about the failure of the Bafin in the case of Wirecard to the ESMA on December 14, 2020. On December 22, 2020, ESMA announced that it had already rejected investigations in the Bafin or Wirecard case and was not responsible for money laundering matters. Although my complaint is not directed against money laundering itself, but against the Bafin in dealing with it, I follow the instructions and contact the EBA with my complaint on December 28, 2020. After the EBA announced on October 1, 2021 that it was unable to meet its 5-month deadline to answer questions, I finally received an answer on January 28, 2022. In principle, my complaint is rejected, since the EBA is only responsible within the framework of EU 1093/2010. The EBA also complains that I have not mentioned which regulations were specifically violated by the Bafin. Regarding the accusation that Wirecard is to be classified as a financial group, the EBA states that the Bafin has discretionary room in its assessment. Regarding the accusation that the Bafin didn't notice the money laundering structures in the group, the EBA states that since the Bafin was only responsible for the Wirecard bank and not for the group, the EBA concludes that there is no discernible problem, especially since I pointed out that the fight against money laundering in the bank had no significant problems. With reference to the accusation of a poorly managed bank book, the anomalies of the synthetic accounts, the loans that have not been written off, and the poor qualifications in the bank accounting department, the EBA points out that the Bafin has already criticized organizational weaknesses and can therefore not find any violation of the supervisory duties. With regard to the allegation of discrimination between the covered deposits in the bank and the non-covered deposits in the group, the EBA, omitting the fact that Wirecard as a whole should have been declared a bank, states that even with supervision by the Bafin, there would have been no deposit insurance in the group. Regarding the accusation that the large auditing firms mostly use too young and inexperienced staff for their audits, the EBA concludes that this is not within the scope of the Bafin. You have to know that the Bafin often does not check itself, but commissions auditing companies. But if you give such orders, you also have to make sure that they are properly conducted. In principle, the EBA relies on the fact that the investigative committee of the German parliament has already started investigations, so that means politicians can do whatever they want. What is the purpose of supervisory authority after all? Finally, the EBA relies on the investigations of ESMA, the authority that previously rejected my complaint. With regard to my complaint against the Sparkus Fulda, it has been criticized that I did not describe my complaint in sufficient detail. This raises the question of whether the EBA is not able to request the relevant documents from Bafin, or whether it does not want to. Under these circumstances, I cannot take seriously the assertion that the EBA is conducting in-depth investigations into the methods used by national supervisory authorities to combat money laundering. The way in which the answers were given makes me wonder whether the answers come from the Bafin itself. Surely they were submitted to the Bafin. Despite an inadequate legal remedy by the EBA, I followed this advice and lodged a complaint with the European Ombudswoman against the rejection of my application. Not surprisingly, the post of Ombudswoman has now turned out to be another alibi post. The Ombudswoman did not notice that the EBA did not initiate a factual examination and therefore could not find any violation of EU law by Bafin. If it is this behavior that is meant by the discretionary powers of the EBA, then the EBA probably has a fairly large degree of discretionary powers. Considering this, the EBA is suggestive of either acting on political instructions and not being independent, or that it is overwhelmed by its tasks and does not have the necessary resources. With my petition to the European Parliament of January 24, 2022 under file number 57 to 2022, I assume that the EBA has good intentions and conclude that the authority is not equipped with sufficient resources. After all, the EBA needed more than 12 months to comment on my message under the title Call to Strengthen the Equipment of the European Banking Authority, EBA, for investigating money laundering, especially at Wirecard. I describe my recent findings. On July 4, 2022, my petition was rejected for the reason that the EBA has sufficient funds and that these are increasing every year anyway. One could easily get the idea that the failure of the Bafin was an isolated case under the leadership of Felix Heufeld. Mr. Heufeld's predecessor, Mrs. Elke Koenig, started with high expectations when she took office, namely of her own achievements. She has sharply criticized the supervisory authorities for their work in the past. A simple example shows whether she herself was able to meet these expectations. During Ms. Koenig's tenure from 2012 to 2015, Wirecard's annual sales and profit doubled, while at the same time the number of employees quadrupled. However, this rapid company development did not prompt Ms. Koenig to take a closer look at the technology company Wirecard. There should have been reason for this, as Wirecard announced in its annual report for 2011 that the British Financial Services Authority is expected to grant an e-money institute license to its subsidiary Wirecard Card Solutions LT. The topic of e-money gained momentum in the financial sector in 2011, and with it the discussion about the differentiation between e-money institutes and ordinary commercial banks. During Ms. Koenig's tenure, the Bafin issued at least 2 licenses for e-money institutes, and further applications are likely to have been pending. So the topic was hot. Despite this, no one asked what might have induced Wirecard not to apply for the license through a subsidiary in Germany, but instead in Great Britain. By then at the latest, Ms. Koenig should have become aware of the business model and corporate structure at Wirecard. As a result, Ms. Koenig must have been faced with the question of whether Wirecard is not a technology company, but rather a financial holding company or even a bank. Regarding Ms. Koenig's background, it is important to know that she previously served on the board of directors of the IASB, International Accounting Standards Board. Based on this, one can spontaneously assume that she should know her job. With this advance praise, laws were changed for Ms. Koenig so that she receives appropriate payment as head of the Bafin. Ultimately, she had better pay than the German Chancellor. Since 2015, Ms. Koenig has been the head of the SRB, Single Resolution Board. This European authority was created in the wake of the 2007/2008 financial crisis to create a bail-in regime. This is to avoid having to call on the European taxpayer to bail out banks again, instead calling on creditors, first and foremost the owners. If Ms. Koenig does an equally poor job at SRB as she did as head of Bafin, supervising Wirecard, European taxpayers are likely to be in for a surprise in the future. One reason to take a closer look at Ms. Koenig's work at the SRB. In order to resolve a bank as part of a bail-in, a liability cascade is set up. The owners of a bank would be the first ones to lose their money. It also makes sense because the owners get the largest share of the bank's income and therefore have to bear the highest risk. The lenders come last. What happens in between makes it exciting. This requires considerable knowledge of how banks and financial markets work. The liability cascade is mapped in regulatory terms via the LDR and MREL reporting. On February 21, 2022, I'm writing to the ESRB, the European Systemic Risk Board, the FSB, the European Financial Stability Board, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, in which I point out, with reference to Article 45 BRRD and Article 72 CRR2, that the LDR/MREL regime contains a serious error in the liabilities excluded from bail-in. The institutions received attached my petition to the European Parliament, in which I complain that liabilities to the central counterparty, CCP, are not excluded from bail-in. First, one must be aware of the importance of the central counterparty. Put simply, CCPs ensure that after a stock exchange transaction, the buyer receives the purchased security and the seller receives the purchase price from the buyer. It usually takes 2 to 3 days for the securities to be transferred from the seller's custodian bank to the buyer's custodian bank. In the meantime, the bank books the money from the buyer's account into an interim account, usually a nostro account with the central counterparty. After 2 to 3 days, when the securities are received by the buyer's custodian, the funds are transferred from the interim account to the seller through the central counterparty. The LDR/MREL regime has considered these interim accounts as available for bail-in. This means that in the event of a bank failure, the central counterparty would not receive its money, but would still have to pay out to the seller. The problem is that a central counterparty must not bear any risk. Therefore, it only has a risk weight of 2%. If a central counterparty defaults, the financial markets would collapse due to a loss of confidence, similar to the 2007/2008 financial crisis when the interbank market collapsed. At this point, Ms. Koenig had already been head of the SRB for 7 years. That means their only job is to deal with such topics. Since 2019, I have done 2 projects for half a year, each at MREL. Still, I had to explain to the regulators how to do their job. The error shown has now been corrected. In my petition 1338/2021 to the European Parliament of November 21, 2021 on the dismissal of Elke Koenig as head of the SRB, I explained the above-mentioned facts. With reference to Ms. Koenig's failure as head of the Bafin in the Wirecard case, I described my concerns about what could happen if someone with Ms. Koenig's qualifications is up to resolve a larger bank in Europe. It is doubtful whether a bail-in will be successful under these circumstances and whether the taxpayer will be spared out. On June 25, 2023, I informed the aforementioned institutions that nostro accounts must also be excluded. Nostros are mirror accounts that usually have the same function as repo derivatives. Of course, repos are also excluded from a bail-in. It remains to be seen whether this request will also be implemented. Ultimately, my petition 1338/2021 got rejected too. No reason was given. The rejection of all 3 well-founded petitions to the European Parliament can only be attributed to German politicians influencing the petitions office, but not a single parliamentarian has that much influence. In my message of May 9, 2022, I call on the President of the European Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, to resign from her post, citing my previous findings. In the further course, it will be shown that Mr. Heufeld was not the first unsuspecting head of the Bafin, and he should not remain the last.